All right, so today we're going to be doing a deep dive into a book that I think kind of like flips the script on
Yeah.
something we're all, told to like really embrace.
Yeah.
Perseverance. It's Annie Duke's Quit. The Power of Knowing When to Walk Away. And I think it challenges us to rethink when sticking it out might actually be holding us back.
And I think what makes this deep dive so intriguing is Duke's background. We're
Yeah.
talking about a woman who's not only a former World Series of Poker champion, but also holds a PhD in cognitive psychology. So talk about knowing when to hold them and when to fold them, right?
Exactly. She brings this really unique blend of high-stakes decision-making and then just a deep understanding of how our minds work. And today we'll be exploring all of that, not just the psychology of quitting, but practical strategies from Duke's book that you can apply to your own life.
We're talking about insights from economics, game theory, behavioral psychology,
Wow.
even examples from mountain climbing, and of course, poker.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Right off the bat, Duke points out how deeply ingrained the negative view of quitting is in our culture. She even mentions how there are hardly any famous quotes that actually praise quitting.
Well, except for that one often misattributed to W.C. Fields. If at first you don't succeed, try again, then quit. No use being a damn fool about it.
Right. But, as Duke points out, not exactly sound advice. And it turns out, Fields never even said it.
Yeah. And it's fascinating how this lack of pro-quitting sentiment reflects a larger cultural bias. We're bombarded with stories of grit and perseverance,
Yeah.
Think Grit by Angela Duckworth or the famous 10,000 hours rule popularized by Malcolm Gladwell.
Right.
It's like we're conditioned to think that giving up is synonymous with failure.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that pressure, this idea that you just have to power through no matter what.
Yeah.
But Duke's book makes you wonder at what cost. So help me understand this. Why is quitting so hard for us on a psychological level?
Well, one major roadblock that Duke identifies is the sunk cost fallacy. You've probably heard of this, but think about it in terms of like a personal example. You've already poured thousands of dollars into fixing up an old car. Logically, it might make more sense to just cut your losses and get a new one, but you've invested so much already.
I've been there throwing good money after bad, hoping to justify those initial costs.
Yeah, and Duke cites studies on stock traders that show that they'll often cling to losing positions longer than they should because of this very fallacy. They're so focused on what they've already lost that they lose sight of making the best decision for the future.
It's almost like our ego gets in the way. Is that what Duke means when she talks about quitting being an identity issue?
Exactly. Our sense of self gets tied up with our commitments. Think about it. Quitting a job, a project, or even a relationship can feel like admitting you were wrong in the first place.
Like you're somehow flawed or less capable. It's easier to double down and tell yourself you're just being persistent than to face that potential hit to your self-worth.
Right. And that brings us to another major obstacle Duke highlights: the status quo bias. Our brains are wired to prefer what's familiar, even if it's not actually serving us well.
Right.
It's easier to stay on autopilot than to rock the boat.
So we might even mistake that resistance to change for courage. I remember Duke shared an anecdote about that in the book. But that's why she argues that quitting isn't this inherently negative thing. It's a skill, a deliberate choice that, when done well, can actually propel you toward greater success.
And that's where things get really interesting, because Duke provides us with a toolkit for making those smarter decisions about when to hold them and when to fold them, whether you're in a boardroom, a relationship, or climbing Mount Everest.
Okay, I'm all ears. So what's the first tool in this quitting toolkit?
One of the most practical strategies Duke offers is the kill criteria, predefined criteria for quitting before you even begin a project, an investment, or yes, even a relationship.
Kill criteria. That sounds pretty intense.
Yeah.
But I'm intrigued, though. Can you give me an example of what this looks like in the real world?
Imagine you're a mountain climber planning to summit Mount Everest. These climbers set what's called a turnaround time. Let's say it's 2 p.m. If they haven't reached the summit by then they turn back down, regardless of how close they are.
No matter what, even if they're just a few hours from the top.
Exactly. And it's not about lacking ambition. It's about recognizing that the risks of pushing past that point, exhaustion, changing weather conditions, far outweigh the potential rewards.
So it's like having that pre-commitment in place, knowing your limits and sticking to them, even when emotions are running high.
That's the power of the kill criteria. It takes the emotion out of the equation. Instead of getting swept up in the moment, you've already made the decision based on a clear-headed assessment of the situation.
So how can our listeners apply this to their own lives? I mean, most of us aren't climbing Mount Everest.
Think about setting kill criteria for a project at work. If we haven't hit these key milestones by date, we reevaluate our approach or consider shifting resources to something else.
Or even in your personal life. I'm thinking about those relationships where you keep putting in the effort, hoping things will change, but
You could have kill criteria for a relationship. If these specific behaviors don't change within a certain time frame, I know it's time to move on. It's about giving yourself permission to quit before you even start, which almost seems counterintuitive, but is actually incredibly empowering.
I love that. So we've got the kill criteria to help us walk away. But how do we even know when to set those criteria? I mean, sometimes it's not that obvious whether something is worth pursuing.
That's where another strategy from Duke's book comes into play. Tackling the hardest part of a task first.
Oh, yes. I remember that anecdote she uses about monkeys and pedestals. It cracked me up.
Right. It's a thought experiment. Imagine you have to train a monkey to juggle torches while standing on a pedestal. What do you do first? Build the pedestal or train the monkey?
Well, building a pedestal is pretty straightforward. But training a monkey to juggle torches, that's a whole other level of challenge.
Exactly. So the lesson here is tackle the monkey first, that most daunting aspect of the task. If you can overcome that, you know you're onto something. If not, you've saved yourself a lot of wasted time and energy on the pedestal.
I love that. It's like ripping off the Band-Aid. Getting that reality check early on.
It's about front-loading the risk and recognizing that not everything we attempt will succeed. And that's okay. It frees us up to focus on the things that do have potential.
This is all making so much sense. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we've got one more strategy from Duke's book to unpack. And this one involves a bit of a mind shift. Reframing quitting itself.
Absolutely. Duke argues that sometimes what looks like quitting is actually a strategic pivot, a calculated redirection of energy that can lead to even greater success.
And remember that great example she uses to illustrate this point. It's from the tech world, right?
Yes, she talks about Stuart Butterfield, the founder of Slack. He originally created this massively multiplayer online game called Glitch. It was visually stunning and unique, but it never really took off.
Glitch. I vaguely remember hearing about it.
Yep.
So he basically quit. But that's not the whole story, is it?
Not at all. See, Glitch had this internal messaging system that the development team used. And Butterfield realized this system, which combined elements of instant messaging and email, had the potential to be something much bigger.
And that, my friends, is how Slack was born.
It's a perfect example of how what appears to be quitting on the surface can actually be a brilliant pivot. And Butterfield didn't just abandon his work, he took the best parts of what wasn't working and transformed them into something remarkable.
Slack, of course, went on to become a multi-billion-dollar company. It makes you think about all the potential Slacks out there just waiting to be discovered if we can learn to quit well.
And that's what we'll be diving into even deeper in the next part of our deep dive. How do we develop this quitting muscle, this ability to recognize when it's time to walk away and have the courage to actually do it?
Stay tuned, because we've got a lot more to explore, including how to navigate the emotional challenges of quitting, even when you know it's the right decision. So we're back. And, before we jumped into this, the whole idea of quitting strategically felt kind of like paradoxical to me. But now I'm starting to see it as this like crucial skill, this ability to make intentional choices that lead us to a better path, even if it means like letting go of something we've invested in.
It's recognizing that clinging to something that's no longer serving us can actually be more detrimental than just making a clean break. It's like trying to drive a car with the parking brake on. You might keep moving forward, but you'll never reach your full potential.
It's a great analogy. But I think what trips a lot of us up is how do we know when it's really time to quit? Are there any like red flags, any signs we should be paying attention to?
That's where developing what Duke calls your quitting muscle comes in. It's about tuning into those like subtle cues that might be telling you it's time to reassess a commitment. One thing she suggests is paying attention to like your emotions. Are you constantly feeling stressed, drained, or resentful when it comes to a particular project or relationship?
Yeah, I've definitely been there, that feeling of dread whenever you think about a certain task or commitment. It's like your body is trying to tell you something.
Exactly. And Duke points out that we often ignore those emotional signals. We tell ourselves we just need to push through or that things will eventually get better. But sometimes that underlying feeling of unease is a sign that you're on the wrong path.
So our emotions can be a guide. But what are those situations where it's not so much about our feelings, but maybe other people are telling us we should quit? I'm thinking about like entrepreneurs who get pushback from investors or artists who face criticism. How do you filter that out?
That's where Duke suggests the concept of a quitting coach. It's like having a trusted advisor, someone who can provide an objective perspective, especially when you're too emotionally invested to see things clearly yourself.
So it's like having that friend who'll give you the tough love you need even when you don't want to hear it. But how do you find the right quitting coach? And how do you make sure they're not just telling you what you want to hear?
That's a great question. It's about choosing someone who you respect, someone who's not afraid to challenge your assumptions and push you outside your comfort zone, someone who will ask those hard questions that you might be avoiding.
So it's not about surrounding yourself with yes men, but finding someone who can help you see the bigger picture, even if it's a picture you're not initially excited about.
Exactly. And that's why Duke emphasizes that a quitting coach isn't about telling you what to do, but helping you develop the tools and the confidence to make the best decisions for yourself.
Okay, so we've got emotions and quitting coaches. What other strategies can we use to strengthen that quitting muscle and make those tough decisions with more clarity?
Well, Duke also highlights the importance of being mindful of optionality. It's this idea that there are always other paths available to us, even if we can't see them at the moment.
It's like that saying, when one door closes, another one opens. But sometimes we get so fixated on the closed door that we miss all the other opportunities that are right in front of us.
Exactly. And that's where quitting can be so liberating. It frees you up to explore those other options, to pivot into something that might be even more fulfilling than what you left behind.
So it's about viewing quitting not as an ending, but as a new beginning.
Precisely. But how do we actually see those new beginnings? Duke suggests a thought experiment called a premortem.
A premortem. That sounds a bit intense. Are we talking about predicting the future here?
Not exactly. It's more like a mental simulation. You imagine that your project or goal has failed, and then you work backward to identify all the potential reasons why it might have gone wrong.
It's like a what-if scenario planning session, but with a focus on failure rather than success.
Right. By anticipating those potential pitfalls in advance, you can adjust your approach, or if the risks seem insurmountable, maybe decide to quit before you invest too much time and energy.
It's like a reality check.
Yeah.
A way to ensure you're not charging blindly into a disaster.
And Duke also suggests a related technique called backcasting.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What's the difference between a premortem and backcasting?
With a premortem, you're starting with the hypothetical failure and working backward. But with backcasting, you start with your desired outcome, your big, hairy, audacious goal, and then you work backwards step by step to figure out what needs to happen to make it a reality.
So it's like creating a roadmap to success, but in reverse.
Exactly. And by mapping out those steps, you can see more clearly whether the path is realistic and whether you're truly willing to commit to the journey.
It's like having that aha moment where you realize, wait a minute, this is going to require way more time, energy, and resources than I initially thought. Am I really prepared to make those sacrifices?
And if the answer is no, then quitting might be the smartest and most courageous choice you could make.
This is all so insightful. I feel like we've really unpacked the psychology of quitting and explored some incredibly practical strategies for making those tough decisions about when to walk away. But there's one more piece of the puzzle I think we need to address: the emotional side of quitting. Even when you know it's the right decision, it can still be really hard to let go.
Absolutely. Quitting, even when it's strategic and well thought out, can still be emotionally challenging.
It can be downright painful, especially when you've invested a lot of yourself into something. We'll be right back to talk about how to navigate those emotions. Okay, so we're back. And, let's face it, no matter how strategic or well-timed quitting can still be kind of like emotionally tough, right?
Yeah, it's true. We tend to wrap so much of ourselves up in our endeavors, our identity, our sense of worth. And it's natural that walking away, even from something that's no longer serving us, can trigger these feelings of failure.
It's like we're not just letting go of a project or goal, but a piece of who we thought we were. But Duke suggests a really powerful shift in perspective.
Yeah, she encourages us to think of quitting as a way to honor our future selves.
Wow. So it's like saying, hey, I'm not giving up on myself. I'm actually making a choice that will allow me to grow and become the person I want to be. It takes the focus off the immediate loss and puts it on the long-term gains.
Exactly. And to help us kind of navigate those inevitable feelings of sadness or disappointment when we do quit, Duke emphasizes the importance of self-compassion.
It's like giving ourselves permission to acknowledge those feelings, to grieve what we're letting go of, rather than beating ourselves up for not being able to tough it out.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that feeling those emotions doesn't make you weak or indecisive. It makes you human.
So how do we actually practice this self-compassion? Is it as simple as saying, it's okay, I'm feeling sad about this, and that's all right?
It can be as simple as that. It's about acknowledging those feelings without judgment. But Duke takes it a step further, and she encourages us to actually celebrate our non-successes.
Non-successes. Okay, I'm intrigued, but I need you to break that down for me. What does that even mean?
Well, it's about recognizing that even our so-called failures, our quits, can be incredibly valuable learning experiences.
It's like those moments when you think you've messed up, But in hindsight, you realize they led you to something even better. It's just hard to see it that way when you're in the thick of it.
Yeah, Duke actually recommends keeping a failure resume.
Hold on, a failure resume? That sounds almost counterintuitive.
I know, right? But it's actually a brilliant way to track your non-successes and the lessons you learned from them.
So instead of trying to bury those experiences or pretend they didn't happen, you're actually documenting them, analyzing what went wrong, and extracting those valuable insights.
Exactly. It's a tool for turning setbacks into opportunities for growth. And when you start to look back at your failure resume, you realize that many of your biggest breakthroughs came after a period of, well, not succeeding.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've gone from the psychology of quitting to practical strategies for making those tough decisions to even reframing how we view failure itself. So as we wrap up this deep dive into quit, what's the one key takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
That quitting, when done strategically and with intention, is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength, of self-awareness, and a commitment to living a life that's true to your values and goals.
It's about having the courage to choose yourself and your future, even if it means letting go of something you once held dear.
And one final thought to leave you with. What if instead of fearing quitting, you actively look for areas of your life where walking away might be the best option?
So it's about taking stock of your commitments, your job, your relationships, your projects, and asking yourself, is this still serving me? Or am I holding on out of habit, obligation, or fear?
And reframing quitting as a strategic reallocation of resources can take some of the emotional charge out of the process and make it more about optimizing your time and energy for the things that truly matter.
There you have it, a deep dive into the art of knowing when to walk away. We encourage you to keep exploring this idea and developing that quitting muscle. Maybe even start your own failure resume and see what insights you can glean from those non-successes. And remember, sometimes the most courageous and successful thing you could do is quit